So I will begin by introducing our first speaker. So we're delighted that Anasuya Sengupta has been able to join us. So Anasuya is co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge. She has led initiatives in India, in the USA, across the global south and internationally, and she's been doing this work for over 20 years, working to amplify marginalized voices in virtual and physical worlds. She's the former Chief Grant-Making Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, former Regional Programme Director at the Global Fund for Women, and a 2017 Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow. And in 2018, she also received an Internet and Society Award from the Oxford Internet Institute. And I think when you see and hear more about the work she's doing, you'll understand why. Anasuya today is going to talk to us about decolonising the Internet's languages and some questions of epistemic injustice. So I will hand over now to Anasuya. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I'm just going to do my best to share screen without too much fuss.
Great, that's all working.
There we go. Excellent. Amazing when technology really does work. Adab, namaskar. Hello, everyone. It's a delight, pleasure, and honor to be here with all of you today. I'm Anasuya Sengupta. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our work as a global online campaign, Whose Knowledge. Bunty, thanks for the shout out already earlier this morning. And talking particularly about what it means to decolonize the Internet's languages and some of the questions of epistemic injustice that we deal with as we do this. Whose Knowledge, as I said, is an online campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities, the majority of the world, online, which essentially means that we work to make the Internet and public online knowledge less male, straight, white, and global north in origin. And so that brings me to just a quick note about the word decolonizing. I will talk more about epistemic injustice in a minute, but particularly because we are all using the word decolonizing in multiple ways from multiple contexts at this moment and have historically as well. I want to make sure that we, as Eve Tuck and Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and other Indigenous scholars have exhorted us to do, we use the word not only as a metaphor, but particularly as practice. Decolonizing for us is very much about shifting and transforming the structures of power and privilege, both historical and current, that have made empire, have been processes of colonization, and of course have constructed new forms of colonization, colonialism, and empire online. Having said that, let's look at the broad picture. We care about knowledge. And if we look at books and publishing as a proxy and language as a proxy, our frenemies at Google, when they were doing their digitization project, Google Books, estimated that there are about 130 million books that have been published in only about 480 languages of, as we all in this room, virtual or otherwise, know today, of the 7,000 languages that exist, which means just back of the envelope calculations tell you that 7%, only 7% of the world's languages are captured in published material, and an even smaller fraction of that is digitized. So essentially, we are a primarily oral world, and that orality is not yet on the Internet, as many of the speakers have already spoken to. What is the digital world? What does it look like? 59% of the world's population is online already in multiple ways, whether through their smartphone, whether through a browser, and as again, folks pointed out, generationally in different ways through apps versus browsers, Facebook versus Instagram. 75% of those, 3/4 of those who are online are from the global south. 45% of all women are online. And most of the people using the internet, and therefore most of the content, is about 10 of the world's languages. English and Chinese dominate online content. So essentially, we care because the internet does not look or sound like most of us in the world and like many of us in this conference. How do we decolonize knowledge, decolonize the internet, decolonize the internet's languages? For us, it means primarily to see language as a proxy for knowledge. That, I think, is a very key element and as a key anchor for the way that we talk about our work. Language must be seen as a proxy for knowledge. And many of us who are bilingual or multilingual, or even have different languages of academic expertise or focus, understand this when we think about it. But often those of us who work in the technological sides of this don't remember this as much as we need to. So we need to create a truly multilingual internet, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And also, as we critique the current status of the internet, to also recognize the possibility it gives us. In a very ironic and interesting way, the most disembodied global infrastructure of our times, the internet, or its many forms, gives us the possibility of embodiment, of embodying multiple forms of knowledge, especially oral, textual, visual, in ways that are deeply powerful through rich multimedia work. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing for this, and a piece of work we're very excited about talking about and are working quite busily on right now, and I welcome contributions and thoughts later, is a State of the Internet's Languages report. So Bunty was asked earlier by someone, what are the tools we need? I think the biggest, deepest, most powerful tool we need is consciousness. And that often starts with data of different kinds, numbers and stories. And we're very proud and privileged that we've been working with the Center for Internet and Society in India and the Oxford Internet Institute to create this State of the Internet's Languages report, which we hope will be a baseline report that shows, that maps, in a sense, what we do know about the internet's languages and also what we don't know and why we don't know it. And I'm hoping that Kalika will give us a little more data around what she knows and the other panelists as well. So the report will, we hope, show both numbers and experience, map challenges and opportunities, and suggest practical agendas for action. A little bit, a teaser of what we're doing right now and what we're uncovering. We've talked already about some of the sites that people use primarily on the internet. These are websites, so many of the world's users of the internet use, especially from the global south, use apps. They do not enter the internet through browsers, but through apps, including WhatsApp, Instagram, and so on, TikTok, as Sarah said earlier. But this mapping, this graph shows you, through the work of Martin Dittus at OII, a little bit of what we know right now are the languages that are enabled fairly well. And by fairly, again, as we know, there's a range of challenges and constraints within the word fairly. Fairly well represented on the internet so far. Wikipedia at 276 languages. Many more are in what Wikipedia calls the incubator. But essentially right now we have YouTube site navigation at around 75 languages. I think caption support is in many more, probably about 165. But really we are not even at the 480 languages that we have published material in that I talked about earlier. This is another interesting map that Martin has created for us. And he, with Mark Ram at OII, have been looking at digital inequalities for a very long time. And this looks at Wikipedia's local language prevalence. As a Wikipedian myself, I know what it is to be writing and editing in a different language than possibly my own mother tongue. I read Wikipedia in a couple of different languages, but yes, primarily in English. And you can see here what this is a mapping of the different articles on Wikipedia that are geotagged, so that are spatially located in the world, geographically located. And what it looks at is the languages that these geotagged articles are in. And you can see the mapping of what countries have content in the most widely spoken local language, what is a local language but not the most widely spoken one, and what is considered a foreign language. And again, this map also shows you some of the difficulties underlying of definitions. And many, many people at this conference are far better versed in that as linguists than I am. But for instance, just to point out a part of the world that I know well because I'm from it, if you look at India, you will see that it's gray because the maximum number of geotagged articles from India are in English, which is considered a local language, but not the most widely spoken one. So 40% of India's population speaks some variant of Hindi, only about 20% speaks English, according to Unicode's CLDR report. And if you look at Sri Lanka, just below, again, it's in English that most of the content is in, but in Sri Lanka, English is considered a foreign language, whereas in India, English and Hindi are considered, we don't have official languages, but are considered the languages of bureaucracy, for instance, and government, other than in local states where then the predominant local language takes over. Just to show you then the relative colonization of Wikipedia that was talked about earlier as well, most articles about local places on Wikipedia are in English. And here's one of the stories we want to anchor this work in. So we also requested activists, scholars, community organizers, journalists to share with us some of their stories and experiences of being online in their languages. And we hope that these stories will also anchor our report. And this comes from Uda Deshapriya, who is a human rights campaigner and feminist from Sri Lanka. And you can see that Uda talks about Sinhala, which is the official language of Sri Lanka, spoken by over 16 million people. And she talks about how legal documents, court statutes, are not in Sinhala. They're not easily available in Sinhala. Conversations on human rights and democracy, which, as we all know, are deeply important in Sri Lanka, especially right now, often take place in English and not in Sinhala or Tamil. And there is a deep and underlying reason for this, and that is the infrastructure of language, including Unicode. And this is where I want to say once again that, of course, technology is not just technology. It is not just technical, it is social, and it is deeply political. Most of us who are in this conference know this, so I'm already speaking to the knowledgeable, but I feel it's very important to say, especially for those of us who are also techies. And many of us know the issues of diacritics. For instance, in Unicode, even the way that you write is often because it's conceptualized from Latin script, where diacritics follow consonants, but of course, in many of our languages, that is not true. In this case, for instance, as Uda points out, Unicode Sinhala does not allow you to insert combined letters. There are letters that are becoming non-existent as no keyboards even recognize it. So again, it is not just that the internet as it currently is, the linguality of the internet as it currently exists, it does not only reflect our languages and does not only prevent us from bringing our languages online, but as it stands now, there is an active undermining of many of our languages because of what we think of as essentially technical issues, but are also, of course, social and political ones. So we come from the radical notion that people are knowledge. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about the notion of epistemic injustice that the British feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker talks about, and point out how it applies to language. Epistemic injustice, as Fricker speaks of it, is the wrong done to someone in their capacity as knower. And she creates a heuristic of two different kinds of epistemic injustice, testimonial and hermeneutical, and obviously they're interlinked. But testimonial, she says, are when you deflate the credibility of someone. So you disbelieve someone from a community because you essentially disbelieve the entire community. That, as we know, is something we are seeing every day on the streets of America and many other parts of the world, where the police stop a Black person because they disbelieve their credibility in multiple ways. Hermeneutical is when you don't make sense of the social experience of someone that is different from you. And that too is something we understand when we don't even conceptually understand something. For instance, when a culture that doesn't understand sexual harassment believes it doesn't exist. Now, in language, this form of epistemic injustice is true, and we don't often talk about it that way, but whose language do we believe? Whose language do we give credibility and legitimacy to? Most academic peer-reviewed journals, for instance, are in English. 60% of those indexed on JSTOR or Scopus in both social science and science, for instance. We don't often believe in the concepts of different languages. So the world systems of knowledge are constrained by the language in which you speak. And again, there's a universalizing when you can only speak in particular languages, often those that are colonial. And so I end with these two provocative questions that guide our work, and I hope will be something we respond to together. Is it that as the internet stands right now or exists right now, we can really only easily be on the internet in our nearest colonial language? English, for instance. This presentation is been translated by my compañeras into Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese, also colonial languages, because they are from Bolivia and Brazil, respectively. And in this process, how much difference and different forms of knowledge and different embodiments of knowledge is being flattened out, lost, or not preserved. And with that, I will stop here and say that we have more of what we do on our website, Whose Knowledge, which right now is multilingual in about 6 languages. And we have volunteer translators who work on different parts of it. So a very big shout out to all of them, some of whom might be on this call. And I'd be happy to talk more once everyone else speaks. Thank you so much. Shukriya and Dhanyabad.